Hello, everyone, and welcome to the San Francisco Opera Guild's virtual preview of Carmen. Some of you have seen Carmen more times than you can count, but some of you, this might be your first time. Personally, Carmen holds a special place in my heart because it was the first opera I took my now husband to when we first started dating, and we're still together, so I think it was a good pick. Before we jump in, I want to share just a little bit of information about San Francisco Opera Guild and our mission. We were established in 1939, and while we are technically a separate nonprofit organization from the San Francisco Opera Association, many of our programs are in support of the opera, including these opera previews. But our primary commitment is to bring quality education and arts engagement programs to schools and the community. You might be familiar with our schools programs such as Opera Together, formerly known as Opera a la carte, and our student dress rehearsal program. But we have an incredible variety of offerings for students K through 12 to ignite a creative spark and grow curiosity about the arts while teaching collaboration, self-esteem, along with critical and metaphorical thinking skills. I encourage you to learn more about the Guild's work by visiting us at sfoperaguild.com. For today, if you have questions throughout the event, please drop them in the chat and we'll do our best to address them at the end. Now on to our main event. Dr. Alissa Deeter is a distinguished soprano and conductor known for her dynamic performances and innovative interpretations across a broad spectrum of musical genres. Alissa's solo recording entitled Hier Mélodie of Francis Poulenc can be downloaded from multiple music services, and she can also be heard on the Albany Records recording From the Heartland. As the conductor of the Portland Symphonic Choir, Alissa is celebrated for her vibrant leadership, which includes fresh perspectives on familiar works and a focus on creating a cohesive and dynamic choral sound. Under her baton, the choir has continued its reputation of high-caliber performances, collaborating with celebrated artistic organizations in the Portland area, including the Portland Youth Philharmonic, Pushful Dance Company, the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra, and the Oregon Symphony. Alissa is also dedicated as an educator and throughout her career has contributed to the music community through various initiatives, including outreach programs, workshops, and masterclasses. Her commitment to expanding the reach of music and nurturing the next generation of performers has been a hallmark of her professional life. Alissa's reputation as a soprano and conductor is marked by her exceptional commitment to the arts and her influence on both her students and the broader music community. Welcome, Alissa. Thanks so much for leading our discussion tonight.
Hello, Lauren, and hello, everybody. I'm so excited to have been asked, and I'm so excited to talk about Carmen. And I'm sure, as Lauren pointed out, many of you know this work. Many of you might have seen it 100 times, maybe not 100, but many. Some of you might have seen it in multiple languages. It is a destination opera. When it's on a season, it tends to be the thing that pulls us all forward into getting to the theater. And so because it's so familiar to many of you, and even if it's not as familiar, there are things about it that you know even if you don't know it. I'm going to sidestep the standard synopsis, let's go through the show sort of way of doing things. We're going to focus on some different information for Carmen because you can always look up that storyline, and hopefully the things that I'm going to share with you tonight will make it even more compelling to do that. So let's go ahead and get started.
What a treat. We're actually going to start by taking a look at the marketing poster for this production. I thought you and I could just talk through it for a minute.
Sure.
Okay. So in your eyes, what do you see? I mean, obviously this is intentional for the marketing department to create this poster for this opera. So I thought maybe we could just highlight some of the things that we noticed.
Well, I mean, obviously that dress is stunning, and the red flare that is going down the dress represents it represents flower petals. It is probably also the metaphor for blood. And you cannot not see those big bullhorns that are taking up the page and framing her. And what a delightful arabesque arm that she has going with the flare of the fingers to sort of represent that sort of Spanish hand in that folk dance. It's a delightful image.
I was going to say the hands really stuck out to me as kind of the castanets that you almost,
Mhm.
how they hold. But I agree. I want this gown and I'd like to wear it for opening night, just without the blood.
Well, good luck if you get it. Take a picture for me.
All right. Well, I will let you take it away from here. Thanks so much.
So let me share my presentation and we'll get started with our Carmen discussion. So I'm an academic first and foremost, I suppose, these days. And so as I went and, sort of did my research, it's what comes up again and again in the writing is that Carmen is the perfect opera. And I thought, well, that's such a bold statement. So let's go ahead and talk about what could make Carmen a perfect opera. Now, I'm not saying that it's perfect opera. I would never be so bold. But since it is a statement that is out there, it's certainly worth our time to frame some of the characteristics that make this opinion so prevalent. So we can look at a few different elements to Carmen that could elevate it to this perfect opera status. One of them is the compelling characters. Carmen represents common people. Before Carmen, I mean, we saw a movement towards what Bizet did here, but prior to, people buying a ticket and going to an opera house, especially when composers were court composers, often our material was royalty or gods. We didn't have a lot of opera just about normal people. And so it's very compelling that he uses a story that talks about not aristocrats or royals, but just everyday folks, but everyday folks exhibiting shocking behavior. Working at a cigarette factory, walking out on a hot day, smoking a cigarette, a woman no less, controversial. People getting in public fights, controversial. Carmen in Act 1 gets in trouble because she is in a fight in the cigarette factory and actually carves a cross on another girl's forehead. That's a little bit rough. And so these portrayals of characters that are living a proletarian life, just a regular, industry working person, and that value that they have is measured by their ability to work in industry, but having sort of an interesting lawlessness or even a questionable morality. So we can check the box on compelling characters, right? Another thing is a vivid sense of place and time. Bizet uses a very interesting, we are in the moment here. We are in Seville and we are watching this happen right now. It is very much like reality TV, but on the stage at the Opera Comique. And this again was groundbreaking at the time. It certainly takes the place of those old worn out stories of gods from so long ago. So the reality and the fact that you couldn't really escape that, it wasn't something you could sit back and ponder because you were watching it like a live action show, was perhaps a little too close to home for some people. Emotional high stakes. This opera doesn't give us any time to think about, well, what if Don Jose did this instead of that? Or maybe Carmen should do this instead of that. There's no time. We buckle up and we get on this impulsive and impetuous roller coaster ride that doesn't care about how we feel about it. The music is daring, it's exotic, and it's complex. And this word exotic, I will bring it back a number of times tonight in our discussion. But this daring music features a variety of musical styles. Bizet really threw in a lot of various elements and different musical approaches in order to help define his characters and their truth in the music. And it's very interesting. The Spanish influenced elements that he uses are what we call exoticism, and we will talk about that in a minute. And Bizet writes a very complex score, and it was so complex, is so complex that when he gave it to the instrumentalists at the Opera Comique, many of them didn't want to play it because they thought it was too hard. It wasn't what they were used to. The other thing I want to point out is that it is superbly orchestrated. And, it's just one of those things. If you don't notice, it's okay. It's so perfect that you don't even have to notice anything except that it fits together just like a beautiful jigsaw puzzle. And one of the ways we know that it was so well done is that Ravel himself said, if you want to learn about orchestration, take a look at Bizet's score of Carmen. And Ravel himself was a very fine, excellent orchestrator. So a wonderful value from a wonderful composer. And this work was admired by composers as diverse as Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Massenet, and Wagner. And if you know a little music history, you know that Brahms and Wagner, they didn't get along. And so the fact that they both loved Bizet says a lot. And Wagner proclaimed, here at last for a change is someone with ideas. So what I'd like to do now is put this opera to the perfect opera test. And we're going to use the Toreador song as our litmus test to see if it checks at least some of the boxes to hit perfection. In the Toreador song, we have Escamillo, who is, by all rights, a very compelling character. He is a matador. And indeed, Bizet makes up a word here, and it is called, the word is toreador, which is actually not a word. Torero is the proper word, but Bizet needed another syllable for his toreador garde. So just could you imagine if it was torero garde? Just doesn't quite snap the same, right? So Bizet just takes a liberty here and adds a syllable and sort of makes up a new word with toreador. And a couple fun facts about bullfighters. We see Bizet here lifting up Escamillo as like in a hero worshipful way. Another reason he is a compelling character. And the music that Bizet uses for Escamillo is indeed in that exoticism lane. He is using Spanish influenced elements in order to create this feeling of otherness for Escamillo, rather than the everyday, let's say, more normative or normal music. Escamillo falls more towards the exotic because of how Bizet set him musically. Matadors historically actually were not rock stars. They were, they kind of did a thing, but they weren't LeBron James. And this is sort of how we see Bizet set Escamillo as being, the Michael Phelps of toreadors. And, reality, a good win for a matador would have been the ear of the bull. And if you did a super good job, you would have gotten both bull ears. But Bizet has elevated him so that we've created a little distance between the everyday common people and Escamillo sort of being in the exotic other level, that bucket that I will talk about. So we know that he's a compelling character. We have a vivid sense of place and time. We are at the tavern of Lilias Pastia, and we are having a party right now. And so it is evening and we're all having a good time. So the sense of that nowness is very real and very vivid. I wouldn't say that we necessarily have emotional high stakes in the Toreador song, except that the chorus is just gone crazy with hero worship for Escamillo. And there is that introduction of attraction between Escamillo and Carmen. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Actually, we can talk about it right now. As we talk about what makes exoticism prevalent or relevant, both of those words really, in the Toreador song, one of the things that Bizet uses besides this, he uses these rather kind of Spanish influenced rhythms in the minor key to begin, so that Escamillo has the drama of the minor key in order to wow the audience and the crowd with his stories of bullfighting. And as he does that, he notices Carmen. Carmen's not looking at Escamillo, and that creates an attraction for Escamillo. Remember that, because that very statement's going to come back later, but in reverse, but not really reverse, but for Carmen looking at somebody else. The other thing that Bizet does here is he uses on his da 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 da, but he uses a descending chromatic scale. And that has a really interesting chromatic, like it's like a dangerous descending scale, that as he's talking about the action with the bull before he goes to talk about and the audience goes wild, and then they come in, that crowd cheers, and then they take over the chorus. So let's look at a little bit of Escamillo and see if we feel like it is indeed representative of a perfect opera. How fun is that? So there's just nothing that gets me, like, it's just so rousing and just like so cheerful to have that entrance of Escamillo. He gets this huge entrance, like it's a whole thing. So Bizet really makes a big deal about Escamillo. So I feel like it is certainly a good marker towards a perfect opera moment for Escamillo. Now let's talk a little bit about some history of Carmen and some fast facts. I'll try to be quick about this because we have a lot to talk about. So I know, a timeline, I couldn't help myself, but when I look at music and I look at art, I want to understand how it fits into history, because art doesn't live in a vacuum. Art is relevant to the things that are going on at the time. So I thought it was really interesting to take a quick look at a busy time in 19th century France. And I'm not obviously going to go through all these points, but if you do come back at some point and revisit the video another time, I don't know, you can kind of re-eyeball it and sort of see some of the things that I pointed out as it is by no means complete. But a couple of things I just wanted to point out. France had a rough time in the early 19th through the mid to late 19th century. They had to exile Napoleon I. They had to go through 2 revolutions. And then they had the fall of the Second French Empire during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. We see Bizet born in 1838. So he sort of lands right in the middle of all this chaos. France's industrial revolution was delayed a little bit. It was, in fact, Europe in general, but France, I don't know if I would say especially, but certainly one of the later countries, in the comparison of Great Britain, whose industrial revolution started like 1760. So as things start moving and growing and winding up for the Industrial Revolution, Paris goes through a huge population burst around 1850s or so. Francis Paris is probably hanging around about 900 plus thousand people. In the span of about 20 years, maybe just a little less than that, that number almost doubles. And so, just as a fun fact, I looked up the current population of San Francisco, and as of today, it's hovering around 800,000 inhabitants in San Francisco. So, think about, like, let's just say 15 years, going from 800,000 people in San Francisco already tightly packed, and then just doubling that number. You're going to have issues with where people live, how they get their resources, where they're going to sleep, how they're going to eat. And a lot of these people coming into Paris were there for industry. So they were working those working class jobs. There became an even greater rift in the socioeconomic divide because of this huge influx of people in Paris. Berlioz was very sensitive to this. And so let's talk about him for a second. So he was born in 1838. He was a piano prodigy. He went, I can back that up and just give a little more information. His father was a wig maker, which I don't know why I find that compelling, but I do. Also a voice teacher. His mother was a piano teacher, which is probably where he got his early start in playing the piano. And they wanted to cultivate those skills, so they sent him to the Paris Conservatoire at the age of 9. Actual age of enrollment was 10, so he got in 1 year under. His teachers were Charles Gounod. Of course, you know him from some of his operas like Faust and Romeo and Juliet, and Fromental Halevi, who was a Portuguese. He comes from a rather large artistic family from Portugal, who they had emigrated to Paris prior. And so Fromental, who happened to have his own compositional career and did have some of his own works performed in Paris at different opera houses, was one of his primary teachers. Bizet, by all rights, was amazing, an amazing pianist, an amazing musician. He won the Prix de Rome in 1857. And if you don't know what the Prix de Rome is, it is a French award given to a student, and the student could be visual arts, musical arts, sculptors, that kind of thing. And they were able to go to Rome for 5 years and work and study in Rome and create there. And while Bizet was in Italy, there was the Italian Revolution was going on, and so he was very sensitive to that in Italy as much as he was in Paris. He didn't have his most prolific time while he was in Italy, but if you know his Te Deum, if you've ever heard that choral work, it is something that he wrote. I feel like it's 1858. I might be making that date up. I'm sure somebody can help me be honest there. But it is a wonderful, wonderful work, and I highly encourage you to listen to it, because I don't think that we appreciate Bizet enough outside of the Carmen bubble and his other opera that we know by name, which is The Pearl Fishers. I'm going to sidestep that conversation right now about the Verismo School that I have on that slide. We'll come back to it in a second. So let's keep moving. So why did Bizet choose Carmen for his opera? Remember, think about those perfect opera characteristics that we talked about. The appeal of the subject matter was rich and interesting and relevant. Prosper Mérimée novella Carmen, which was published in 1845, was extremely popular in France at the time. And the story had themes of love, jealousy, obsession. It read very much like a Harlequin romance. Novellas are short novels or long short stories, and there's sort of a formula to them. And Prosper, we'll talk about him in a minute, where he was extremely good at writing them. Carmen was his most popular. Exoticism. This is something we're going to go into it in depth a little bit more in a second, but exoticism was a it was I don't want to say it was a movement, but it was a standard of composition that a lot of composers were using at this time. And Bizet leans into the Spanish story setting because France had a really interesting attraction, obsession, interest in all things Spanish at this time in the 19th century. So it was a perfect fit. A strong, complex female character. There have been strong, complex female characters in other operas prior to this, but they tended to be at the whimsy of the male character. Their fate tended to be in his hands. And so the fact that Carmen is steering her own ship is really interesting and groundbreaking and unconventional. The cultural relevance of Carmen, also interesting because remember, Bizet had feels about social inequity and that space of distance in the haves versus the have-nots. And so this spoke to him most likely, this idea of looking at the consequences that resonated in the idea of wanting to be free, wanting to enjoy your own desire, people who didn't have autonomy or had constraints on how they lived their lives might have found that compelling. So his librettists, Henri Maillac, Ludovic Halévy, who happened to be the nephew of his piano teacher, Fromental Halévy. These two gentlemen took on the task of writing the libretto for Carmen. They knew each other for about 20 years and they collaborated on about 14 different opera libretti. The ones that you might know the most fully are Offenbach, La Belle Hélène, La Pericole, the Grand Duchess of Gerolstein, those. They were known for their witty, clever writing. And it's worth noting that they weren't crazy about the Carmen novella and setting it. They went along with it because Bizet was insistent, but they questioned whether it was suitable for this stage, and they worked hard to try to soften some of the hard edges of the story in order to make it more digestible for the audience at the Opéra Comique. Prosper Mérimée, who we just mentioned, he was a French writer and a pioneer of the novella. And his novella Carmen was indeed his most popular. It was supposedly it was inspired on the story of an actual murder case that happened in Spain in 1830. The Countess of Montijo, she was a Spanish noble, had told Monsieur Mérimée about this story, and it stuck with him about this, this ruffian who killed his mistress and consecrated herself exclusively to the public, right? So he was fascinated with this story, and so he decided to make his heroine a Romani woman in the story. Now, I have to go off on just a slight fast fact about Mérimée. There are two that I want to tell you. One was that he was also a noted archaeologist and a historian, and he worked in 1830, that was the July Revolution. And so we see one monarchy, the Bourbon Restoration, gets kicked to the curb, and Louis Philippe comes into power, the first. And so he brings Prosper Mérimée into the fold to be the inspector of French historical sites. And along with the writer Georges Sand, he discovers these amazing tapestries called The Lady and the Unicorn. And if you have been to the cloisters in New York City that is owned by the Met, you might have seen similar tapestries that are green with different unicorn stories. In this particular bundle of tapestries, there are 6 that all equate to the senses. And it really captured my attention because I love the unicorn tapestries at the cloisters. They are both Flanders, they are Parisian in their design, but made in Flanders, which is like, I think originally North Belgium, Dutch influenced. So I just found that to be just a wonderful side note about Prosper, and because he had so much free time, he also learned Russian because he loved Russian literature and the language, and he translated from Russian into French some of the great Russian writers of the time, including Alexander Pushkin, who wrote a long narrative called Les Gitans in 1827. And Prosper did translate this prior to writing his novella. So the inspiration is here in Pushkin's long narrative, another thing for him to glom onto for his story. And indeed, there are parts of Pushkin's narrative poem that are in Carmen the opera, but not in Prosper's novella. So it stands to reason that Bizet and the librettists were aware of Les Gitans and probably also used it as source material. And the third one, I just want to throw this in there, is George Henry Borrow, an Englishman, who wrote the Zincali in 1841. And I thought he was important to note, not because of, I mean, what he did, I can say this better, what he did was he actually went to places where Prosper and the librettists are picking up stories and they're sort of like creating a story without ever having like gone and done primary research. Like, I'm going to go to Spain and I'm going to learn some things. George Henry Borrow actually went places and learned about them and then would write travelogues on his experience. And his book, The Bible of Spain, in Spain, was so popular that it outsold Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol in 1843. And we know that Mary May found this to be a source of inspiration and information from a letter that he wrote to Mademoiselle Jeannie d'Aquin about using Borrow's writings to help him better understand the gypsy lore at the time. So let's talk about exoticism. This is a musical trend to evoke the sounds and imagery of distant cultures. This is very popular in the 19th century. Faraway lands incorporating musical elements that were perceived to be exotic. But this is the thing I want to talk about. It also created distance between the regular people and the others. There's an otherness to exoticism, things that are far away, things that you don't quite understand and you fantasize about or you dream about. Composers used exoticism in many different ways because it was so, people wanted to know more or learn more. The world was just starting to crack open because of the Industrial Revolution, and they were learning that there were places further than 10 miles away to go vacation in the country. Particularly prominent for the French was their interest in all things Spanish. And I mentioned that earlier. But it wasn't just the 19th century. We can find exoticism that goes all the way back to Purcell and the Indian Queen. We can see it in Handel's opera Xerxes. We can see it in Mozart's opera The Abduction from the Seraglio, and other 19th century composers that you're probably familiar with: Bizet, Brahms, Debussy, Ravel, Puccini, obviously Turin, Dot, Madame Butterfly. I'm sure you could like throw some in the chat. There's so many that you probably enjoy. The use of exoticism in Carmen reflects the political unrest in 19th century France, the power struggles of social class, race, and gender for sure. Bizet used this as a device to create distance between what might be considered normative and what might be considered unconventional. And it's very clever because he has this libretto that's a little risque, a little dangerous. It is more bold, more violent, more real time than anything else that has been at the Opéra Comique ever. And so for him to use exoticism puts a little distance between the regulars of Paris and the unconventional. And exoticism puts distance there, so it's safe, so that you can watch it, you can ponder it, you can think about it, but it's not about you, it's about the other. And so it gives a lot of room to study human nature and to look at the emotional and psychological effects that we find in Carmen. In addition to those musical exotic elements, Bizet also evoked visual exoticism with colorful sets and also used very exotic lyrics in his libretto. Carmen's exoticism is one of its most salient and important features, most likely, but it does create some critical tensions in how it fantasizes race, class, and gender. So let's just talk about that for a quick second. Nope, we are going to listen to the Seguidilla first. I keep forgetting I put that there. So let's look at some exotic elements in the Seguidilla, which is in Act 1. So Carmen has just gotten into a knife fight in the cigarette factory, and she's gotten yanked out, and one of the lieutenants is on his way to go get the warrant so we can send her to prison. And guess who he gives the task of guarding Carmen to? None other than our famous Don Jose. And so the Seguidilla intimates some traditional Spanish dance and song. The Seguidilla as a dance form, and it is truly a dance form, is known to be fast and in triple meter, that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have that da ba da da 1 da da ba ba ba. So we have this really quick, dancey, flirtatious rhythm that reflects this free-spirited nature of Carmen for sure. The aria also contains references to like what the French might have thought to be Spanish culture, like we're going to go drink some manzanilla and dance some seguidillas at a bar. But that seemed very un-Parisian. So of course it fits into the bucket of exoticism, something that the others would do. It is designed to mimic Spanish folk melody, a very interesting sort of scale that we're playing around with some modal scales instead of our standard do, re, mi. So let's go ahead and listen to some of the Seguidilla. This happens to be, I forgot to put Roberto Alagna on this with Alina Garancha. These two have done numerous Don Jose's and Carmen's together. So their chemistry is really exciting to see. This is the Metz production from 2010.
Chez mon ami la spazia, j'irai danser la Seguidilla, boire di manzanillo. J'irai chez mon ami la spazia. Oui, mais toutes ces lanceries, elles lèvres plaisissantes à deux, donc pour me tenir compagnie, j'appellerai mon amoureux. Mon amoureux, il te diable, je l'ai mis à la portée, mon pauvre cœur très consolable, mon cœur est libre comme l'air. J'ai des gants à la douzaine, mais ils ne sont pas à mon gré. Voici la colline sereine qui veut m'aimer. Je l'aimerai, qui mon âme est à prendre. Vous arrivez au bon moment. Je ne crains de m'entendre, car avec mon bel amant, près des remparts du ciel, chez mon ami la spazia, j'irai danser la Seguidilla, boire di manzanillo. Oui, j'irai chez mon ami la spazia.
I don't know why I have that on my screen. Hold on just a second. Max, do you see that?
No, it looks good on our end. We're back to
Okay, I'm just gonna
screen.
pull. I have this weird like stop in the name of love hand from Zoom, but I'm just going to ignore it. So we're not going to worry about that. Let me get back into full slideshow mode. Now, one thing I want to point out about that video, Carmen knows exactly what she needs to get the job done. Did you see how she went to the table and pulled her skirt up? Because Carmen wants one thing, to get out of that rope. That's what she needs. She's flirting with Don Jose because she doesn't want to go to prison. I do think that their attraction is a true thing, but at that point, she needs to get out of that rope. And so you can see how she's using the power that she has at her disposal, which isn't a lot, in order to try to get what she needs. The other, don't want to play that again. There we go. The other one I want to play for you really quickly is the opening of Act 2. So wonderful little chorus, sometimes called the chanson bohème, or more colloquially known as the gypsy song, and is swung by Carmen and her friends. That's supposed to be sung. Sorry about that little typo. And so this is a wonderful opening to the act. It sets up a whole new, like, where are we right now? Remember, a perfect opera, like the vivid sense of time and where are you? And so we know in Act 1, the way Act 1 starts with the prelude, that we are in a local square in Seville. This Act 2 opening changes where we are, and we're going into the other territory. We are not with the regular folk anymore when we start this. This one that I'm going to show you is just a wonderful rethinking of the opening of Act 2 by the Met. They have some really wonderful, like they bring in some flamenco foot stomping that is I'm going to get this wrong. It's a technique called zapateado. And you'll see it with the foot stomping and the clapping. And it's just a wonderful addition to the feeling of exoticism. So let's go ahead and watch that because it's just wonderful. As much as I'd like to keep going with that, I have to journey through. Let me see if I can keep this going here. Nope, just having a few slight technical bugaboos, but we're going to keep sallying forth. So you can see how that really sets up this is where we are now versus where we were in the last act. And I would say out of all of the exotic elements that Bizet does in this, I find that one to just be so compelling. I just love everything about it. I love the music of it, the visual and the lyrical of it. So let's keep chugging forward. There we go. So let's talk for a second about the use of the word Romani and the use of the word gypsy. In his novella, Professor Alissa uses gypsy to describe the Romani characters, and indeed those words seem quite interchangeable. It was a very common term at the time, despite the fact that it really misrepresents the origins of the Romani people. And his depiction, like many of his contemporaries at the time, was influenced by stereotypes and exoticism, which were common in the 19th century. And I just want to say this out loud, the term Romani and awareness of the Romani people's cultural identity were less clearly defined during the 19th century. So the word gypsy was and still is often used in a pejorative way, reflecting the stereotypes of the time. So the Romani people were believed to have originally migrated from northern India, and they went from northern India, they went through what was formerly Persia and what is now modern day Iran before they made their way into Europe. And that was, that took a long time for the migration. Nobody really knows exactly why they started the migration, but scholars, they conjecture that perhaps, they just they maybe didn't have the resources they need where they were. The English word gypsy is actually derived from the Middle English term Egyptian or Egyptian, which I thought was very interesting. The Romanis in Spain refer to themselves by the endonym Calais, which comes from their language Calo. And currently, there are approximately 12 million Roma people living in several nations around the world. The Romani ethnic minority in Spain has long been subject to institutional discrimination and persecution. And they still are suffering from this today. Somebody asked me earlier about whether the Romanis had been able to sort of level up in Spain. And I think that although I'm sure that is true to an extent, their education scores are still some of the lowest in Spain. So there's still a lot of marginalization going on. And despite that marginalization, which we attribute to be over 600 years of, the Romani have made significant contributions to Spanish history and culture. If you want to learn more about the Romani people, I put down a few resources for you to check out. The Roma Peoples Project at Columbia is a rich source of information about not just history, but about what is happening with the Romani now, and what more can we do in order to afford more resources for the Romani people. The United Nations memorializing the Romani past gives a lot more historical pretext to the conversation. I found this to be particularly interesting. The Joshua Project Romani People Cluster, if you go, because if you remember the prior slide, it says that there are 12 million Romani people living all across the world. And so the Joshua Project shows the different people clusters of Romani people that are worldwide. And the Romani Cultural and Arts Company is reflective of Romani arts and culture now, and what art is being made by the Romani people and how you can be a part of supporting that if you'd like to learn more. So let's talk about the habanera. So in order to talk about the habanera, we need to sort of go back and talk about the toreador. There are many similarities between Carmen and the habanera and Escamillo and the toreador song. Now remember, I said that exoticism in Carmen creates a sense of otherness, people that aren't like us, they are other. And we already kind of can assume that Carmen for sure is other, Escamillo is other, but what Bizet does is he gives them a lot of musical similarities. So remember that Escamillo and his, I've got to get into my head, that descending chromatic scale, Carmen also has descending melodic material in her, and he's doing his they're very interestingly similar. They are also constructed similarly in that there is a verse that is in a minor key and then a major chorus. So they both do that. And now here's the kicker, the thing that I really love, is that when Escamillo comes in, he sees Carmen. She is ignoring him. And so now he wants her. When Carmen comes into the village square on the cigarette factory break and sings the habanera, she looks at Don Jose, who is not looking at her, and now she wants him. Very similar. And remember, at the end of this aria, she throws the rose at Don Jose. That is basically I choose you. This is my calling card. Take this rose. She hurls it at him. The habanera is a social dance, which is usually done by couples. So it's very interesting that that Carmen's habanera is by herself, alone. It is reflective of Spain, but actually Cuban in its actual, like, where it comes from. So that's just an interesting side note. I was telling the class this afternoon that Bizet didn't really worry about primary research. He just wanted something that sounded Spanish. So he went with whatever was laying around France at the time. So let's go ahead and listen to the habanera.
Apprivoiser, et c'est bien on va qu'on l'appelle, s'il lui convient de refuser. Et en effet, menace aux prières, l'un parle bien, l'autre se tait. C'est l'autre que je préfère, il n'a rien dit, mais il me plaît.
Just wonderful. It's just as iconic as the Toreador in so many ways. It's just a delight to listen to it. Sorry, I'm just a little bit on having a few issues, but we're going to keep working until we get them out of the way. All right, so I'm going to skip the synopsis because I don't think that we really need it, but I do want to just mention the characters. We have our more normal or normative characters. We see that in Morales, who is one of the officers, Zuniga, who is a lieutenant, Micaela. This is the girl from Don Jose's hometown. Just a normative, normal person. And she's very important because she is a stark contrast to Carmen. So when we think about Carmen being other in her exoticism and therefore in the choices that she gets to make that we might consider not to be proper or normal, Micaela she's the standard bearer of what they might consider normal at the time. So that comparative is a very important thing. Don Jose is also a normative character who gets pulled away from his normative status. And you see it in the flower aria where he just starts to crack. He can't go back to being normal, but he doesn't know where to go next. And so he's sort of in the in between two worlds. We know that Carmen and Escamillo are in the other exotic bucket. And then we have Fresquita and Mercedes, Le Dancaira and Lo Remendado. These are all revolutionaries, friends of Carmen, and they are delightfully fun, which is so interesting because we know that they are still considered to be Romani, but they are the lighthearted part of the opera. They bring levity, almost like a humorous relief to some of the drama that we are seeing from the other characters. So they're not really developed in any sense, but they are super fun to listen to. So remember I said Micaela was a normative character. We see her as part of the us and not part of the other. She represents innocence in her identity. She wears often, they will costume her with a cross around her neck because her aria, it's an A structure. So we have a section, we have a little contrasting section, we go back to A, and both of her A sections, at the end of them, she pleads to God to help her get through this mountain pass so she can see Don Jose, tell him that his mother is dying and that he needs to come home. Micaela is supposed to marry Don Jose. They were engaged. And so she's come all this way to find Don Jose, find her a man and bring him back to the home, bring him back to the hometown. And so she prays to God to give her strength. Micaela's phrases tend to all go up. When you think about her phrasing continues to escalate and roll upwards, whereas Carmen is, she's pulling her phrasing down chromatically. Very different approaches. And Micaela is so like down like the narrow path of what would have been considered proper French and Parisian. Her music could have been written by Gounod. It feels very reminiscent of Faust or Romeo and Juliet. So let's listen to a little bit of it. She says right there, protect me, Seigneur, protect me, God. And so you can hear how she's written to just sound quintessentially like I'm from a French grand opera. That's sort of the character trait that they're giving her. So let's look at our other normative Ishi character in Don José. And I just want to lean into this one for a second, because I do feel it might be one of the most important parts in the opera. And I've always kind of been a bit diminutive about it, but I had a friend who sang this role many times, and he really schooled me on the psychological battle that's going on in Don José's head. So here he is, he has gone to jail for Carmen because he let her go, basically let her go, and he went to jail. And now was released. He was in jail for 2 months. He was released the day before. And all he had of Carmen was this flower. So she throws the flower at him. She dances the seguidilla. He goes to jail. So this is the first day he's seen her in 2 months. And he's got this flower, this dead, dried up flower. And he comes in, and he is, you know, a torn person, because he's actually still a soldier. He's been demoted. So he knows that he still needs to go back to the barracks. He actually doesn't end up going because of circumstances. But what is so interesting in this aria is that it is a through composed aria. And if you don't know what that means, it means that where we start in the aria, we don't hit that material again. It is a stream of consciousness that ends somewhere else. That is in contrast to Micaela, who sings what you just heard almost on a rinse and repeat at the end of her aria. And that both Escamillo and Carmen have verse, refrain, and their material repeats. But Don José is on an emotional roller coaster. And I think that Jonas Kaufmann just really hits us right where it hurts. We see the struggle in his eyes. So I think we should just play some of it. It's a very powerful performance.
prenez à te maudire, à te détester, à me dire pourquoi faut-il que le destin de blasphème, et je ne chantais en moi-même, je ne chantais qu'un seul désir, un seul espoir, de revoir au Carmen, j'étais une chose à toi. Carmen,
That is a broken, broken human being. And it's just really put it, that for me makes Carmen, I understand it, because that he's in no man's land. He can't be normal anymore. They took away his normal music. And he's not an other. He's just he's a through composed stream of consciousness, and the music never lies. It will always tell us the truth about a character or something that's going on. And we are watching in real time. We're watching this character have an emotional breakdown right in front of us. A very, very powerful moment that I feel like Jonas Kaufman does just with absolute class. It's a wonderful performance. There we go, back to the slideshow. So we have a couple more things to talk about and we will move forward in our presentation, if I can get off the video. Okay, just a really quick thing about the smugglers, the Act 2 quintet. Remember I said we've got the regular folks, we've got our other folks, and we have the smugglers, and they are just a delightful, fun, romping group of delight. We're going to go steal stuff. What is wonderful about them is that in this fluid situation that they're moving through in the quintet, it is so perfectly synchronized. So you can feel it's almost like they work together as a team. They know each other so well that they know how to even finish each other's sentences. So let's just enjoy the quintet for just a second.
Nous avons en tête une paire.
Belle dame, dites-nous, belle dame, dites-nous.
Elle est admirable, ma chère.
Mais nous avons besoin de vous, oui, nous avons besoin de vous.
De vous, de vous,
De nous,
de vous, de vous,
de nous. Mais nous avons besoin de vous.
de vous, de vous, de vous, de vous.
I just wanted you to hear that for a second, because that the lightheartedness of the smugglers, that to me is just as important as anything else. It's just a little bit of an amuse-bouche to keep us moving through the plot of the show without getting too overly weighed down with all of the emotional and psychological drama that keeps churning forward with our main characters. So, how was Carmen received? Well, if you know your history about Carmen, you will know that it was not received well. The Opéra Comique in Paris, which happened to be established in 1714, just a fun fact, it was considered to be the family-friendly opera house in Paris. And so putting the Carmen, like the libretto from the Carmen novella, which everybody knew, into the Opéra Comique was not, they were not in agreement. And so I'm just going to read part of this wonderful quote by an administrator from the Opéra Comique at the time. And this is from Halévy, one of the librettists, one of his letters. The Monsieur Louvain, who is the administrator, said, "Carmen, Mérimée Carmen, isn't she killed by her lover? And these bandits, these gypsies and these girls working in a cigar factory at the Opéra Comique? You'll frighten our audience away. That's impossible." And so at the end of this amazing little letter that Halévy says, in conclusion, Mr. Louvain, he acquiesced, but after a prolonged struggle. And when I left his office, he said, "Please try to not let her die. Death at the Opéra Comique, that's never been done before. Do you hear me? Don't let her die, I implore you." Let her die. The orchestra members, as I mentioned, they complained about the score being a little too hard, and the chorus actually complained about having to act. They weren't a fan, and actually some of the chorus members complained. And the woman who was singing, Carmen Gallimarie, she made Bizet rewrite the habanera no fewer than 14 times in order to get the habanera that she wanted. I don't think I mentioned, by the way, that the habanera, the lyrics were written by Bizet and not the librettists. Even so, no one thought this was going to be a scandal. The dress rehearsal went well, the premiere reviews went okay, and the audience was so scandalized by the opera's obscenity and immorality that the opening night audience fell silent. Worse than being booed, silent. And so we know that Bizet left to go to Bougival because he had probably throat cancer. He was a lifelong smoker, and he died after the 33rd performance. Carmen closed after 48, but he had already written or signed a contract with the Vienna Court Opera before he passed away. So Carmen was going to Vienna no matter what, which was really fortuitous, because it went to Vienna that Carmen continued to gain steam and become the worldwide phenomenon that it has become. That trip to Vienna is where his friend, a fellow composer, changed the dialogue to recitative so it could be performed in the more grand style. If you don't happen to know that Opéra Comique sort of requires us to use spoken dialogue. Interestingly enough, it was the Vienna court composer who used some of the recitative, but also pulled in some of the dialogue and kind of created this little mishmash of both, which kind of went away for a while and has come back into fashion as we sing Carmen. Carmen was first performed at the Met in 1884. And I love this story, having been in San Francisco for so long, that in 1906, the Met brought Caruso to sing Don Jose, and then they go all the way from New York to San Francisco, and he sings it at the Grand Opera House in San Francisco. It was the night before the big earthquake, and all of the performers were awakened by the vibrations of the earthquake, and so they were all able to get out of the Palace Hotel in time. But there's an urban legend that Caruso was standing outside in his nightshirt with a signed picture of Theodore Roosevelt, trying to use that as leverage to demand special attention. I don't know if it's true, but I like the story, so I'm going to say that it is. So the last thing I want to leave you with today is the fate motif. One of the most pervasive and recognizable musical ideas in the Carmen score. And for all of the all of the exoticism that we've talked about, that is like Spanish influenced exoticism, the faith motif is beyond. If the exoticism of Carmen and Escamillo and all of those things that were sort of like Spain influenced is other, this is otherworldly. It goes beyond just the other bucket. I want to play you just a little bit of the theme that we hear in the prelude. In the prelude, he continues to develop it and it gets bigger, but sometimes that's all we hear in the opera is this ba na 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 na. That's it. It's all over the opera in little tiny wisps here and little tiny wisps there, but there are 5 very prominent times that we hear the fate motif. And I had started part of this presentation was going to tell you where they were, and I decided not to share it because I feel like it's going to be your journey to sit and listen to Carmen and discover when you hear the fate motif. The fate motif is interesting because the argument is, if it's an argument, is whether the fate motif is Carmen directing her own fate or whether fate is beyond Carmen, beyond just reading some cards, right? In the card trio where she reads her own fortune of death. It is perhaps the juxtaposition of Micaela praying to God that the fate motif is out for Carmen. And I actually don't have an opinion. I mean, I do, but I'm not going to tell you. You have to make your opinion about how the fate motif works in your understanding of the music. And this is one of the reasons why it's timeless. There's no answer. It's where you come into relationship with this music and how you feel it tells the truth, because the music never lies. But it might tell more than one truth. And so it's up to you to decide what kind of truth it tells. Thank you so much for letting me talk about Carmen for the last hour. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Alissa, and hello audience. I'm Max from San Francisco Opera Guild. That was really wonderful, Alissa, and you have such a beautiful singing voice. I had no idea. Um, but we have a ton of really great questions, and I want to get into it. I think one that has come up a few times now, that I think is really important is addressing how modern productions are dealing with the exoticism that you spoke about. How are some contemporary productions of Carmen adapting the more problematic story elements?
This is a really great question because in the traditional sense, and the Francesca's direction is very traditional. We see us being set in Seville in the, early 19th century. So she's taken a very originalist approach to this, complete with the horses and the kids. But we also see other productions that take it out of Seville and they take it out of this feeling of sort of like that working class Romani, like feeling that cultural like differentiation between the others and the everybody. And they drop it into other scenarios and other storylines. I saw one just the other day that was about Elvis was Escamillo, and I was there for it. And but human nature is always going to be the same. The emotional and psychological content of the opera never changes. That is really the most important thing. So understanding and respecting the history of Carmen and appreciating that where we are with this work now and, tipping our hat to the history, but respecting the Romani people along the way and knowing the marginalization that they've had to suffer, and yet in their suffering, they've offered us up this wonderful, their influence has offered us up this wonderful opera, is certainly not something we should hide. We should elevate it, we should respect it, and then we can move into other productions that you don't necessarily need to use those specific influences in order to make Carmen relevant and powerful today.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great answer. We have a ton of questions from Helen, one of my favorite audience members.
Hi,
Um,
Helen.
Helen, um, so first off, she wants to know why women smoking was so controversial for the time.
I don't actually know the answer to that, except I'm going to just assume that they maybe weren't supposed to be smoking in public. And that is something I should look up, Helen. Because obviously our administrator friend at the Opera Comique thought it was a scandal. So there must be truth in it. But as to why, there are, of course, a lot of things that women weren't supposed to be doing. There was always, whether women could dance in public, whether women could drink in public, right? And so I suppose smoking is one of those things. And I was actually going back to thinking about Georges Sand and her relationship with Prosper Mérimée. And one of the things that we know about Georges was that she was a feminist first and foremost, and that she wore pants and she smoked and drank in public. So I can't tell you why they shouldn't have, but I can tell you that for people to do it was certainly slightly scandalous. So I'm going to look that up.
All right, that sounds good. We can send her an email afterwards. But certainly there seems to be a bit of an arbitrariness to what women have been prevented from doing historically. So perhaps we'll never know. Another question from Helen. She's curious about what parts of Pushkin are in Carmen. Like, what was the relevance there?
Let me go back, Helen. I actually did write some of these things down. There are several lines and scenes that appear verbatim from his Les Gitans that we find in the opera, but they are not in any corresponding place in the novella. The Tra-la-la aria from Act 1, for instance, has its analog in a scene in the Pushkin narrative poem. Her line, coupe-moi, brûle-moi, right? Cut me, burn me. That is not in Mérimées' novella. That is in Pushkin's narrative poem. The love is like a rebellious bird. That is actually from Pushkin's novel, his narrative poem. It is not from Mérimées' novella. So those are three examples.
We have a really interesting question. It seems like in many operas, older, more experienced singers can play younger roles, but this audience member has had a lot of experiences where the leads in Carmen are typically played by much younger performers. Why do you think that is? Is this just sort of a random anecdotal experience, or is this generally how Carmen is cast?
There are some outstanding variables there that I might not know, like how many times in the last, let's say, decade that you might have come across that. So let's just assume that there are a couple unanswered variables, but we can speculate. I think that Carmen is a very accessible opera for younger singers. I mean, it takes a really good instrument, but it's still quite accessible. So I think that is number one. The staging of Carmen has really escalated over time. I will use a very colloquial, the park and bark of yesteryear, when we would see a lot of opera singers just take stage, stand, sing their stuff, and walk off. We've really grown beyond that to something that is a little bit more visually involved. And so if your Escamillo has to get on a horse, let's say, you might not be able to do that. You might not be an Escamillo who is 60 and has, maybe some predisposing factors that would make that difficult. Yeah. So there's a comfortability, I think, to the demands of the staging that could limit certain singers, but I can't say that is That is for sure.
All right. Well, that's super interesting. And there is a horse in this production. Thank you for reminding me. His name is Drogon. Everyone should come and see it. Um, we have a question from Colleen. This is really interesting. I like this question. Has Carmen been popular in Spain too? She's curious what the Spaniards think of being exoticized.
Ooh, again, that's a really good question, and I'd have to look it up. It has performed in Spain, of course, but it had performed. I think it was performed in Spain before 1900, but I'd have to look up that fast fact, and I'm pretty sure it was well received, but it didn't get there right away. So, and it's funny, we have a friend who is from Mexico who works with Max, and Celeste was speaking today about being from Mexico and so many of the things that we consider to be exotic in our Western European ideal. In Mexico, they have habaneros, they have secadillas, they have this influence for them that is not exotic. But Cece's comment was, and I thought it was really wonderfully framed, that human nature is always true. Whether or not the exoticism is there or not, the psychology and the emotional content is true, and the music never lies. So we find it whether or not it is exotic to us.
Also, we did get an answer from our audience from Google. The Spanish premiere of Carmen was held in Barcelona in 1881 and was a great success. Thank you, audience member. It does seem like after Bizet's death, Carmen really surged in popularity in general. Um, so that doesn't seem super surprising, but that's really good to know. Maybe one more, and then we'll wrap up, and Peggy can do announcements, if that's okay. We have a question. Is Michaela a dramatic foil for Carmen's character? Confusion about why she's important to the story.
A dramatic foil, would I say she's a foil? Not a knowing one, right? I don't think she knowingly is a foil. But as a comparative, we learn so much about Carmen because so many characteristics are then like, we look at Carmen and our measure, right? Our measuring stick is Micaela. And so we see the departure of normalcy because Micaela is she's at the starting line for that. What is also interesting about Micaela as being such an important character is that she doesn't develop. We never see her grow. She's really instrumental and she has a task, but she doesn't grow, which is, foils don't tend to grow. So in your description of her, I think that we could say, it wouldn't have been my way of describing it, but I think that we could say that is a true thing.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for. But thank you again so much, Alissa. This was really wonderful and super informative. I'll have the recording online within 24 hours, probably later this evening, if anyone wants to send this to their friends. And Peggy is going to do some announcements, and I will put all of the links to the things that she describes in the chat. So, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for joining us tonight. And hopefully you can get to the Opera House. By the way, I'm Peggy Hill, and I'm on the previews committee and with the San Francisco Opera Guild. But again, hopefully you can get to the Opera House to see one of my favorite operas ever, and I could see it 100 times and still be quite happy. But it will be live streamed Tuesday, November 19th, 7:30, and you just need to get on the San Francisco Opera website and sign up. I think it's $27.50 and well worth it. And then we will see you again in late May and early June for the preview of La Bohème and Mozart's Idomeneo. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and looking forward to seeing you at the Opera House. Good night.